Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Nora Ali. She is a former Wall Street analyst. She was an anchor for, there you are, hi Nora. She was an anchor for Cheddar, and she is working on a super cool new digital media company that is still in stealth, but maybe if you stick around, you can convince her to tell you what it's about. Ladies and gentlemen, Nora Ali.
Nice to meet you, by the way. Thanks, everyone. So this is not about me. I have a great set of panelists here. I'd like to introduce Samir Goel and Abbey Wemimo. They're the co-founders of Esusu. And Kate Pollenchar, she is the MD and global head of venture studio at Anthemis, a fintech-focused VC firm. So we're going to be talking about diversity and inclusion in the fintech space and beyond, and how that leads to innovation, a very timely and important topic. So nice to see you guys via Zoom. I hope you can see me.
We can see you. Likewise.
Hey, everyone.
So
yes.
fancy.
Thanks so much for having us.
So fancy. Welcome. So Abbey, I do want to start with you. You have a fascinating personal story coming from Nigeria to Minnesota. Shout out Minnesota, by the way. My parents immigrated to Minnesota from Bangladesh. So I know what it's like. And you've had some interesting experiences with your family, finding difficulty in getting good loan terms as immigrants. How did your personal experience lead to Esusu, and give us a little insight as to what the company is as well?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. It's incredibly exciting to engage in this thought-provoking conversation. So one thing Samir and I always like to do is just give a quick why behind why we started the company in the first place, which dovetails into your question. And essentially we'll share the theology of Esusu. So for me, I grew up in the slums of Lagos, Nigeria. Had the opportunity to come to the United States for college. So came from 80-degree weather to negative 20 degrees in Minnesota, which I'm sure you're very familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
It was a character building experience. And during that transition, something important happened. My mother and I didn't have a credit score. We walked into one of the largest financial institutions to borrow money. We were turned away and had to go borrow money at over 400% interest rate from a payday loan lender. In addition to that, my mother pawned my father's wedding ring and a bunch of other jewelry, and that's how we got started in the United States. So really inspired by this experience and Samir's experience also, we started Esusu on 3 core premises: where you come from, the color of your skin, and particularly your financial identity shouldn't determine where you end up in the wealthiest nation the world has ever seen. And dare I say, anywhere in the world. And what we do is really simple. We're really focused at Esusu on a vision, which is to leverage data to bridge the racial wealth gap. And what we are doing today is doing everything we can, especially during these dire times, to keep families in their homes. And our business is simple. We work with large landlords and property managers, and we help them report on-time rental data into the credit rating agencies so folks can establish and build their credit scores. So what happened to my mother and I doesn't happen to the 45 million people in this country that don't have a credit score. For folks that can pay rent, we pair them up with a zero interest loan, pay directly to their landlord, so they are not evicted. And as a society, we're not solving homelessness backwards. We also measure those impacts for our partners. And today we're delighted to be in 2 million rental units in all 50 states, and we're just getting started.
So you're focusing on a demo that to some extent gets ignored, but is growing really quickly. So we'll touch a little bit more on how being more inclusive in your target demo leads to innovation. But Samir, what was that aha moment for you when you and Abbey decided to go full steam with Esusu as a company?
Yeah, thanks so much for that awesome question. And once again, for curating this phenomenal conversation. For me, like Abbey, it really stems from my personal experiences, and more specifically, my family's journey immigrating here from New Delhi, India. Our pathway to pursuing the American dream was just harder than it should have been. My father was mugged on his first day in the country. We didn't really have a place for shelter, and most of my upbringing was watching my parents work miracles with no credit and limited financial resources so I could have some of the opportunities that have been afforded. And so like Abbey said, our core ethos is no matter where you come from, the color of your skin or your financial identity, it shouldn't determine where you end up in life. But when you ask us about the aha moment, I think, Abbey and I actually met almost a decade ago now, and originally became good friends and realized that we didn't want to spend the rest of our lives in corporate America, but really do something bigger than ourselves that could give back to the communities that we came from. We actually started out with something a little bit different in the savings world, but had a couple key insights that really drove what we did today. The first is we just talk to people, right? You mentioned the kind of low to moderate income consumer group that's left behind today, racial minorities, immigrants, just folks that are low income. And they said something that was really obvious to us, which is we all know that we need to save money, but the issue is we have financial shocks and there's nowhere that we can get access to cheap capital or navigate these financial emergencies. And so the only place we can go to is payday loans, and you're forced to make choices between being evicted or getting a payday loan. And so that kind of insight from the folks we were serving really helped us pivot towards what we do today, which is partnering with landlords, like Abbey mentioned, to report rental payment data into the credit bureaus. And this is really important for two reasons. One is that the kind of map of people that are left behind in today's credit system and the map of people who are renters are completely synonymous, because in order to have a mortgage, you need good credit, right? So by default, we found a way to qualify and provide a better way of identifying whether or not somebody is trustworthy simply by looking at rental data, which had never been included. The second reason this is really important is when you look at the legacy of America and how wealth's been built, it's all tied to home ownership, right? And one of the things we always talk about is, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, during the New Deal, a lot of folks built wealth through cheap financing, right? The FHA loans, VA loans, and those opportunities did not apply to minorities, Black and brown folks who were systematically denied by the government. And that is the key contributor to why we have this racial wealth gap in America, where white families have 10 times more wealth than Black families, and 76% of that wealth is tied into home ownership. And so as we kind of uncovered more of that legacy and heard both from our customers, but then also the history of this country, we realized this is really this area that we need to focus on to have the biggest impact and really work towards bridging that racial wealth gap.
Yeah, truly creating generational wealth to narrow the gap. So that's really tremendous to hear. Katie, my friend, you at your VC firm have a studio model, which is cool. So you can invest in founders early. You have special programs for female founders as well. So how does sometimes even building a company around a promising founder help to diversify the landscape of the founders that we are seeing today?
Yeah. So, Anthemis Group, we're a fintech VC, just to kind of set the landscape, and then how Female Innovators Lab specifically came to be. So we are a global fintech VC. We've been around for about 10 years, investing across US, UK, and Europe. And we are majority out of 50 employees. We're majority female. Our investment team is majority female as well, which is rare, not only for venture, but finance, as you know. And so really kind of the catalyst, if we looked at, we're also female co-founded, in seeing what we were seeing in underrepresented founders of what are some, how can we start even early on when companies are literally at the idea stage, getting their company off of the ground? And that's really how Female Innovators Lab was born, because we've been doing this work at Anthemis for so long, not only in our investment team, but in how we built our portfolio the past 10 years. And so that's really what we're focused on in working with early stage female founders to launch their businesses. So it is a traditional fund where we invest capital, but we also have every dedicated resources from product, talent, tech, PR, marketing, that early stage companies wouldn't necessarily have the capital in addition to what they've raised to invest in these resources. So we're kind of really trying to put our foot on the gas there and accelerate that. Now, to your question, to your point, it's interesting, right, to see founders' backgrounds and how that has shaped. What Samir and Abbey just said here, these amazing companies that if those experiences wouldn't have happened in their backgrounds, wouldn't necessarily have come to life. And we have a variety of companies. We're investors in First Boulevard. It's a Black digital bank focused on Black America. And, hearing those founders' stories in why this, came to be, their personal stories, et cetera, has really driven how they're developing the product. And that's what I find just super interesting, of that experience is really helping shape what the actual product is, rather than saying, hey, we know we have a problem here, let's go out and build a product. And so we've had a firsthand glimpse into that process, and really working to support it at Female Innovators Lab.
And in addition to having a diverse landscape of founders that you invest in, you also try to make sure that they have an eye towards diversity and inclusion in their approach, to your point, Katie. So when you ask founders what their approach to diversity is, What are some examples of answers that maybe don't pass the vibe check, and some answers that you think does prove authenticity, that they are really looking to be inclusive and representative as a company, not just from their sort of founding team and their employee base, but also as far as who they're targeting with their company?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think, something that we talk about a lot is this conversation comes up early in our due diligence. And we also have a dedicated talent, resources, people, et cetera, in-house to help support those founders. So also part of the lab as well. So it's kind of what doesn't pass the scratch test. What we hear, we've heard at times is, well, we can really focus on that when we get to Series A, or when we can get to a certain capital inflection point. I think that's really shifting. You're not hearing that. I would really say that's, the rarity, the one-offs. But you're seeing more and more, kind of what your customers look like in the market and what their needs are, and realizing that those diverse perspectives are really critical in not only building your product. I've talked a lot about that, but building the intellectual, not only kind of how your team is made up from a demographic, but intellectual diversity, backgrounds, et cetera. And not everyone needs to come from a finance background in building a fintech company. And I think for so many years, that's been synonymous, right? Like assuming, oh, okay, well, if I'm going to be in fintech, we have founders that have been in e-commerce. We have founders that have not necessarily worked in traditional finance. And so we're really encouraging that type of cognitive diversity as well.
Yeah, cognitive diversity is so important to especially understand different levels of your customer and the different needs and their changing needs. So on that note for Esusu, Abbey, you guys have spoken in the past about how intimately familiar you are with your market, with the needs of your customers, existing and future. Walk me through your process for user research, how you understand what those needs are, especially as you intend to grow who that audience is, who that customer base is over time.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I think our experience gives us proximity to the issue, which is central to the work we do, because we're doing it because it's our lived stories. And there are 70 million people in this country that have less than $400 in their bank accounts. And a plethora of those folks, have a subpar credit score also. So the question for us is, how do we pave a permanent bridge to financial access and inclusion for those people? We're leveraging the power of data. It's the new currency. We're gone are the days where we have rhetoric, and that's not going to work. So as we think about our core processes, Esusu has a differentiated approach compared to our competitors. We like to go to market with what we call the platform approach. Folks essentially can focus on one product, which is rent reporting to establish people's credit scores. We go to market, for my initial description, focus on data and insights, reporting data, and then also providing microloans so folks can actually stay in their homes and buy them time. So that's very, very differentiated. And when we actually execute, we go to our landlords, not trying to sell to individual customers. The low to medium income folks we're focused on, you're asking them to pay a subscription fee, however how much it is, you're contributing to their own, financial insecurity. So the question is always look at the stakeholder map, understand who's getting the most value. And that's what we decided to do at Esusu, engage with the landlord or the property managers, work with them to add value. And by doing that, you can also provide an opportunity whereby the folks we care about are not at financial peril. So that's the innovative thing about what Esusu is doing. In a nutshell, is the platform approach, focusing on the one-to-many from a go-to-market standpoint, because that perspective that we don't just want to focus on a tree, we want to focus on a forest. And this is the easiest way to get that done. No one product wonder, create a platform whereby you can really unleash the power of data to bridge the racial wealth gap. And that's why we exist as a company.
You mentioned proximity to the issue, to the challenge that you're trying to solve with the company. Samir, I know you and Abbey went to literally hundreds of investors to make your pitch over time. And oftentimes you are in rooms of people who have never had difficulty getting a loan or paying rent. So what advice do you have for either founders or investors who are trying to start companies or invest in companies where they might not personally have that challenge, that experience, but they do want to broaden their horizons and really understand what those needs are for different markets, for people who are different from them?
All right, that's a really wonderful question, and I think it's something that we grappled with quite a bit. Just to paint some context, like you said, our first round of financing, we reached out to over 300 investors. Only a handful, maybe 3 or 4, said yes, and that was after months and months of kind of going at it. And I think there's a couple of things at play. There's the obvious, right? Abbey and I don't look like the traditional founders you see in Silicon Valley raising billions of dollars at some crazy valuation. But I think taking it a step deeper, to your point, there was a lack of proximity to the problem, right? And people would ask us questions like, who cares about 50 points on a credit score? And Abbey and I know that's life or death, right? That changes your life right there. That's so important, right? Or there'd be questions like, well, how many people would really benefit from this? I'm sure this is just a handful of minorities, or just a few folks that aren't part of the mainstream. And what I think a lot of investors missed was the market that we are focused on is the majority, right? And that was the thing that people weren't seeing. And so to this whole conversation around the power of diversity, there's opportunities that are being lost on the table, right? Because this is there's 150 million folks in this country that kind of fall in this boat of being, financially unstable. And that's the demographic we're serving. That's a lot larger than so many products that are serving kind of the wealthy or the upper middle class sort of demographic, right? So there's a lot of financial upside that's being lost on the table. But to address your question directly, I think number one is people need to keep an open mind. If they haven't lived that experience, then it's important for them to really double down on their customer research, right? To try to talk to people that are using it, to talk to other founders or other kind of VCs they might know that are more intimate with this space or that problem, right? That's one. Number two, there's no way to get around the fact that VCs just need to have more diverse teams, right? There's no way to get around that kind of part of the equation, right? Because if it's just 5 white men that grew up in privileged backgrounds, the reality is no matter how much they want to, there's going to be things that are missed despite the best of intentions. And so they need to take the steps to diversify that team however they can. And then I think, the third thing is VCs love mental models, but I think there's a danger to falling too much into your preconceived mental models, because then you're always looking for the Harvard or Stanford dropout in a hoodie that's doing something around social platforms, right? And there's so much more out there that can be kind of solved. And so those are a few kind of more tangible things I would say. I also think that I would put some onus on the founders. I think Abbey and I have actually been really intentional in our capital stack. I'd say about 80% of our venture funding is from funds that are led by a female partner or a person of color, right? And so founders also can be intentional now that there is more funds out there and who they take on in their capital source, because if Esusu wins, then that gives those VCs and those partners the mandate to continue to invest in founders that don't look like the norm.
I see Katie vigorously nodding her head. She is on the other side of the table as an investor.
Samir just crushed that. That was incredible.
Yeah, that was an excellent response. So Katie, I do actually want to get your perspective on a similar question, in that we know that less than a fraction of a percent of VC funding goes to Black women, for example, still. And you have said in the past that the fact that we are now working more remotely now, more distributed, means founders don't have to be concentrated in Silicon Valley and New York City on the coast. There's more opportunity for diversity as far as founders. So do you have optimism around this? Are you more hopeful? Are we seeing dollars from investors going to founders who maybe don't look like the person on the other side of the table, and more of an open mind on that front?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up where Samir left off, I mean, I am hopeful. I believe there's a ton of work to be done. And to what Samir's point of like, it needs to be intentional. And I'm really kind of betting on the virtuous cycle outcomes, right? Instead of, can we get away from this vicious cycle? But, when more dollars are being deployed and in founders and companies who then may become investors or angel investors, et cetera, who then, can really be intentional about diverse teams and underrepresentation of, what your team could look like, and more equity for those people, stock options, et cetera, right? Really building wealth in unique and different ways to then kind of create this virtuous cycle. And what we're seeing, I often talk about just, completely separate by experience as a woman. Like I had my own tech company, and it wasn't until I was 29 years old that I had met a female tech CEO. And I often say, like, you cannot be what you cannot see. I didn't even know that that was like literally an option for me. It never even crossed my mind until I saw this woman who I connected with, who became a mentor, that was like, oh, wow, this is something that I could do. So I think, you know, as we really look forward to what the opportunities are, there's so much more work to be done, but just having conversations like these, having, you know, Samir and Abbey be founders and talking about it actively and really setting the example for the things that they're intentional about, I really continue to be hopeful about that.
It's much easier now to have these kinds of conversations. There is an appetite for it, where a couple of years ago, I don't think you could quite say the same. I do want to open up the floor to some questions from the audience, if we have them, or if anyone has submitted questions via Zoom. The floor is open. Yes, Kate. Yeah. How do you ensure that if you're trying to do good in the world, you're not taking financing from an entity where you might eventually have to sell out, essentially, right? To, you know, some large entity, some large corporation, that sort of thing. So balancing the do good and finding the right financing partner.
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions. And I'll just be kind of real with you as you're being real with me. I think for so long that venture capital has had historically some kind of bad connotation to it. I think, you know, founders need to be intentional again in looking at who their partners are and having conversations and doing the research and understanding, you know, what portfolio companies they've invested in, what that trajectory has looked like, talking to other founders. What we often do is we open up our portfolios as we're working with potential new investments coming in to talk to any of our founders, because, you know, we would want it to be a relationship that both parties felt comfortable and were interested in. And I think, you know, as we look at kind of also the market shifting of how much dollars are in the market right now, you know, people are saying, oh, could this be a bubble, et cetera? Yeah, it could be. And welcome to the financial markets. And that's a risk we all take every day. But I think what it's forcing is to really take a look at venture capital as a practice, and, you know, how you remain competitive and how you do good in the world. You know, I will be also honest with you, is like the first check that we do on any deals that come across our desk are, you know, around, is there any connotation of any type of predatory lending, et cetera. So we're looking at those things on the side of the table. But then also as a founder of, you know, All Raised does a great example of this, of a fundraising boot camp specifically for female founders, and really educating yourself on, you know, what is market, right? You know, you talked about that control, like, you know, venture capitalists shouldn't be taking control of your company in the earliest stages. You should have independence over decision-making, your board, et cetera. So making sure, you know, in those early stages that you're setting your company up, to make sure that, there's not a predatory on the other side financing situation that you're getting in, because it doesn't need to be that way with the type of early stage capital and really great investors that are out in the market.
Great advice, Katie. Good question, Kate. We have time for maybe one more question. We've got about a minute. Anyone has any pressing questions? Otherwise, we can wrap, I think. All right. Thanks, everyone. Katie, Samir, Abbey, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.